What do you do when your wife's ex plugs his phone into a television at a crowded party and plays a travel vlog that turns out to be a secret romantic trip they took together while she was still your wife? How long can a quiet husband stay calm while everyone laughs, rewinds the video, and your wife swears it was before you, even though the dates on the screen say otherwise? Why did I decide not to scream or swing, but to sit at a small bedroom desk with folders, screenshots, and a single USB stick, and let a set of papers in a hospital cafeteria finish the story for me? Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. My name is Rowan Merrow, and for a long time I believed that honesty in a marriage was simple. You said where you were going, you said who you were with, and the details did not change every time someone asked you the same question. I work as a logistics coordinator for a regional warehouse, which means my days are built out of numbers, labels, and routes. Boxes do not lie about where they came from or where they are going. They either match the manifest or they do not. That kind of order made sense to me. My home did too, at least in the early years, before my wife started using words like curate and aesthetic and story to describe what used to be real life. When Tessa began working at a travel agency, she said in indirect speech that she finally had the career she had always dreamed of, one where she could mix beauty, planning, and adventure. I was proud of her, and I told her that, even as our routines shifted, and I noticed that more of our conversations became about her next post than about our next day. The first time she mentioned the girls' trip, we were in the kitchen of our small apartment, the same place where we kept Maddie's spelling tests on the fridge and our unpaid bills in a drawer. Tessa leaned against the counter with her phone in hand and said that one of her colleagues had invited her on a 3-day coastal retreat to help with content for a small travel brand. She added, in a light tone, that it would be all women, lots of spa shots, and dreamy sunset footage. Nothing for me to worry about. I asked a few basic questions, the kind any husband might ask. What was the name of the hotel? Which colleagues were going? How they planned to divide rooms? She answered in a loose way, naming 2 women I had heard of and one I had not, and shrugged when I asked about the hotel, saying she did not remember but that the agency had it covered. When I paused, she said I was acting like a suspicious policeman and that if I trusted her, I would just be happy she finally had a chance to travel. I told her I did trust her, but that details mattered to me because details were how you kept people safe. She rolled her eyes and said, in indirect speech, that she was tired of being checked and questioned over nothing. Then she changed the subject to Maddie's school project and what we should pack in her lunch the next day. I let the matter rest on the surface, but something inside me had already started to note the vague edges of her story. That night, after Tessa went to bed, I sat down at the small desk in the corner of our bedroom, the one place that felt truly like mine. I opened my laptop and created a new spreadsheet, the kind I usually use to track shipments. This time the columns were different: date, departure time, claimed location, named companions, and any other details she had mentioned. I typed in everything I knew about the planned trip and saved the file without any special name, just a simple label under Archive A. When the trip dates arrived, Tessa packed quickly, filling a small suitcase with light dresses and sandals. I noticed, without saying it aloud, that she slipped in a dress she usually called her date dress, the one she wore on the few nights we managed to get a sitter and go out just the 2 of us. She saw my eyes linger and said, in a half-joke, that the girls wanted nice photos and that there was nothing wrong with feeling beautiful on a beach. I kissed her cheek, told her to be safe, and watched her call a ride to the station. Maddie waved from the window, thinking it was all fun and normal, just a work adventure for Mom. During the trip, Tessa sent me a handful of photos. One showed her sitting at an outdoor cafe with 2 women, faces angled away from the camera. Another showed a beach at sunset, the sky pink and gold over the water. In one photo, she stood on a balcony with the sea behind her, her bracelet glinting in the light. At first glance, nothing seemed obvious, but when I looked more closely, I noticed a tall shadow falling across the railing, a shape that did not match any of the women she had mentioned. I checked the timestamps. A few images appeared earlier than she said she had checked into the hotel. I did not send angry messages or accuse her. I saved each photo into a folder on my laptop, adding notes in the spreadsheet. Time, angle, odd details. It felt less like spying and more like writing down a strange dream to make sure you had the facts straight when you woke up. When she came home 3 days later, she rolled her suitcase into the apartment and wrapped her arms around Maddie first. She told our daughter that the sea had been beautiful and that she had brought her a small keychain shaped like a lighthouse. To me, she said in indirect speech that the trip had been fine but exhausting, that one of the women had gotten sick, and that she had hardly slept. I asked if the content turned out well, and she replied that it was good enough, and that Dylan would probably edit it into something decent if he ever had time. It was the first time she had mentioned his name in connection with the trip, and I felt something tighten in my chest without showing on my face. I had heard of Dylan as her ex, the videographer who used to travel with her before we met. She had always said they kept loose contact, but that he was firmly in the past. Now it seemed the past had found its way into her coastal retreat. That night, when she fell asleep beside me, Maddie breathing softly in the next room, I returned to the desk nook and opened the spreadsheet. I added Dylan's name in a fresh column, marking it with a question mark instead of a label. I pulled the photos into the screen again and zoomed in on the balcony shot until the pixels blurred. The shadow still looked like a man, and the distance between the shoulders and railing suggested someone tall, like Dylan in the few old pictures I had seen. I saved the file, backed it up to another folder, and sat there for a few minutes with my hands still on the keyboard, listening to the quiet apartment. My phone vibrated beside the laptop, flashing a calendar reminder I had set when everything first started to feel off. Harborview Hub, 10:15 a.m., meeting, personal. I stared at it, then clicked dismiss, not because I intended to ignore it forever, but because I was not yet ready to speak these suspicions out loud to a stranger. As I turned off the screen, I heard the building door downstairs open, the echo traveling up through the stairwell. A moment later, our apartment door latch clicked as someone in the hallway passed by, and Tessa's phone on the nightstand lit up for a second. From where I sat, I could only see a small preview, a message from a contact saved with nothing but a single wave emoji. The text line cut off after a few words. Next time, we should... Before I could read more, the screen dimmed again. I sat there for a long time in the half-dark, feeling how small and private all of this was, and how loudly it might one day speak if I let it. A few days after the trip, I went back into the warehouse office like always, scanning screens that showed orders and delivery routes. For a while, I managed to push thoughts of the coast to the back of my mind. Then, during lunch, I heard my coworker Marina call my name from across the aisle. She waved me over with a grin and said, in a teasing tone, that she had found something online I needed to see. On her screen, a social media reel played in a loop. Soft music, sunlight, the camera following a couple walking along a beachfront promenade. The man stayed mostly off camera, but his laugh could be heard. The woman was shown in pieces, her hair blowing in the wind, her hand brushing a railing, her bracelet catching the light. Marina said that the videographer, some guy named Dylan Cross, was trending locally for his secret coastal project, and joked that the woman's profile looked a lot like my wife's. I forced a small smile and told her that my wife worked in travel marketing, so it was not strange if styles overlapped. Marina laughed, satisfied with her joke, and moved on to another topic. When she walked away, I leaned closer to the screen and replayed the reel from the beginning. On the bottom corner, small white letters showed the month and year. It was the same as Tessa's girls' trip. I focused on the balcony shot, the one that showed the woman leaning against a railing. The bracelet matched the one in Tessa's photo exactly, a simple band with a tiny shell charm. I thanked Marina for the recommendation, acting casual, and returned to my desk. As soon as I sat down, I found Dylan's account on my own computer and saved the reel to my files, capturing a few still frames as screenshots. Each image went into the same folder as Tessa's photos, each date added to the spreadsheet. The rest of that day I worked like a person moving underwater. I answered messages, fixed route errors, and filed reports. But it felt as if part of my mind stayed fixed on that balcony and the bracelet. In the late afternoon, my manager, Mr. Halpern, appeared by my desk and asked if I could step into the small meeting room with him. Inside, he closed the door and sat across from me at a round table. He said, in careful indirect speech, that he had noticed I seemed distracted lately, that a couple of minor errors had slipped into my otherwise clean record, and that he wanted to know if everything at home was all right. I told him that I was dealing with some changes in my wife's work life, that it involved travel and an ex she still worked with, and that it was not easy, but I was not going to bring conflict into the office. He nodded, reminding me that the company cared about stability, and that he trusted me to handle personal matters in a way that did not explode in public. When I left the room, I decided that whatever happened next, it would not involve shouting in lobbies or smashing phones against walls. If there was a truth to confirm, it would be confirmed in the same way I tracked shipments, with dates, names, locations, and clear records. After work, I stopped at the supermarket to pick up food for dinner. As I stood in the checkout line with bread, milk, and Maddie's cereal in my basket, the two people in front of me leaned together over a phone. They watched a longer version of Dylan's coastal video and laughed, saying it looked like a secret lover's trip. One of them said, in an amused tone, that she hoped the girl's actual boyfriend or husband never found out, because the footage made it obvious who she really wanted to be with. I kept my eyes on the conveyor belt, but I saw enough of the screen to recognize the same promenade, the same bracelet, and this time, a clearer glimpse of Dylan's face. I paid for the groceries, walked out to the parking lot, and sat in the car for a minute with my hands on the steering wheel. Then I reached into my wallet and pulled out a small sticky note I kept in there for reminders. On it, I wrote the words "Bring Forms" in neat letters and slid it back into the wallet behind my ID, close enough that I would see it every time I paid for something. My phone vibrated twice, first with the same dismissed reminder for Harborview Hub, 10:15 a.m., meeting personal, then with a new group chat ping. In an old friends thread, someone had dropped Dylan's reel and tagged Tessa's username, adding a line asking if she had started traveling with her ex again. I locked the screen without replying, started the engine, and drove home in silence, knowing that whatever this was, it had already traveled far beyond our kitchen. A week after the supermarket line, Tessa came home from work with the kind of bright energy she usually reserved for big campaigns. She put her bag down on the kitchen chair and told me that Dylan and some friends were throwing a small rooftop party to celebrate his new travel project. She said, in indirect speech, that it would be a perfect chance for me to see there was nothing strange between them, that they were just creative partners now. She added that if I refused to go, it would only prove I was stuck in jealousy and did not trust her. I listened while I rinsed dishes in the sink and asked quietly whether this project was connected to the coastal reel I had already seen. She acted surprised and said it was only one of many things they had done together and that I was turning a simple video into a crime scene. In the end, I agreed to go, not to reassure her, but because I wanted to see for myself how they behaved when they thought the story was in their hands. The night of the party, we took the elevator up to a rooftop apartment that belonged to one of Dylan's friends. As soon as the doors opened, we walked into a room full of people talking over music. The far wall was almost all glass, leading out to a terrace strung with lights. A large television hung on another wall, already connected to a sound system. Tessa slipped quickly into the crowd, greeting people with practiced ease, touching arms, laughing, introducing me in a casual tone as her husband who worked in logistics and needed to loosen up. Dylan came over a few minutes later, smiling like someone who lives behind a camera and enjoys being in front of one too. He told me in indirect speech that it was good to finally meet properly, that he had heard I was nervous about the trip, and that he hoped tonight would show me it was all just art. I answered that I was here to see his work and was interested in the details. After some time, when the room had filled and drinks had been poured, Dylan clapped his hands together and raised his voice slightly. He announced that before the serious drinking began, he wanted to share a little preview from his latest project, something he called a secret coastal trip. He waved his phone and walked toward the television, plugging in a cable that was already waiting. People drifted over, gathering on the couches and standing near the bar. Tessa looked nervous for half a second, then forced a smile and told the people nearest her that it was just some harmless travel footage. I stayed near the back of the room where I could see both the screen and the crowd, leaning against a shelf as if it were any other party. The video began with a fade-in from black to soft morning light over the sea. The camera moved along the beachfront promenade, catching waves, railings, shops, and shadows. Music played under it, the same kind of gentle track I had heard in the teaser. Then the shots shifted. Close-ups of a woman's hand trailing against a railing, her hair blowing in the wind, her bracelet catching the sun. People in the room murmured approvingly, saying the footage looked like a travel commercial. Dylan added a caption over the bottom corner, the name of the town and the exact dates of Tessa's so-called girls' retreat. Several guests laughed at the word secret in the title, saying that nothing was secret once Dylan had a camera. As the video went on, the camera stopped pretending the woman was anonymous. Tessa appeared fully in frame, laughing up at Dylan, her face turned toward the lens. At one point, she rested her head briefly on someone's shoulder while the camera swung past a reflective window, showing Dylan holding the rig. The date overlay stayed fixed, quietly reminding anyone who knew the story exactly when these images were captured. A friend near the front said in indirect speech that this looked like a lover's trip, not a work retreat, and asked loudly what lucky man had stolen this woman away. The room laughed, and a few people looked over their shoulders to see how I was taking it. I did not move or raise my voice. Instead, I slipped my phone from my pocket and opened the camera. From where I stood, I framed the bottom part of the television, focusing on the date text and the balcony scene where Tessa stood against the railing. I tapped to record, holding the device low near my chest, capturing enough seconds to show the overlay, the bracelet, and her leaning against Dylan. Then I stopped the recording and returned the phone to my pocket without changing my expression. My heart hurt in a slow, burning way, but my hands stayed steady. I had already decided that I would not try to compete with the television or the crowd. The room could cheer for the story they thought they were watching. I was collecting the story I knew I would need later. When the video ended, people clapped and whistled. Dylan joked that the trip had been a great creative escape and thanked his muse, glancing at Tessa. She raised her glass, laughed in a strained way, and said in indirect speech that it had all been purely professional and that people needed to stop romanticizing everything. Someone near her asked about me, wondering out loud how her husband felt about all this. Tessa smiled too brightly and told them I was still getting used to the idea that my wife had a past and a career. A few faces turned toward me again, waiting for drama, maybe even hoping I would explode and prove whatever stories she had told them about my controlling nature. I simply nodded once and said that the footage was well shot and that the dates were very clear. Then I walked away from the group and headed for the stairwell that led down to the parking garage. In the quiet concrete space beneath the building, the music from above turned into a faint vibration. I sat in the driver's seat of our car without starting the engine, pulled out my phone, and opened the short recording I had made. I watched it twice, focusing on the white letters at the bottom of the screen and the curve of Tessa's bracelet. When I finished, I saved the clip into the same folder as my earlier screenshots and photos, then added a simple note to the file name with the location and date. It felt like sliding another piece into a puzzle that I already knew depicted a kind of betrayal, even if the final picture was not fully clear yet. While I sat there, the phone vibrated again in my hand. The screen showed an incoming call from the contact I had saved as private. I had spoken to that number once before, briefly, to ask questions about what steps existed for people who needed to protect themselves and their children without turning their lives into a public fight. Now the call pulsed silently on the display while footsteps echoed faintly in the garage above, someone laughing as they repeated Dylan's phrase about a secret trip. I watched the call ring out and did not answer this time. I knew I would call back when I was ready, but I also knew that something had shifted inside me. The trip was no longer a suspicion. It was a documented event, with dates, faces, and reactions, projected on a huge screen while people laughed and looked at me like a side character. A few days later, our families gathered at a busy restaurant to celebrate Raphael's birthday. The place had the kind of long table that forces everyone into the same conversation, whether they want to be there or not. Balloons bobbed near the ceiling, kids at other tables shouted about cake, and servers moved quickly with pitchers and plates. Our group settled into a loud, slightly messy arrangement. Tessa and her parents at one end, my parents at the other, Maddie in the middle between us, and my brother Caleb somewhere near the center. At first, the talk stayed close to safe topics. Raphael asked about Maddie's school, Irene mentioned a book she had started reading, and Caleb shared a story from the garage about a customer who tried to pay in small coins. At some point, Lourdes turned to Tessa and asked, with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, whether the recent coastal campaign had gone well. She said in indirect speech that she had seen some beautiful footage online and that her daughter looked like a real movie star. Tessa laughed and launched into a light version of the story, saying that Dylan had invited her to help on a small project, that it had been a whirlwind of shooting and editing, and that people were making too big a deal out of it. She described the rooftop party as a fun night with friends and said that certain people in her life were stuck in old ideas about marriage and could not handle a woman working with her ex professionally. She did not use my name, but halfway down the table, several heads turned toward me. I let her finish her story before I spoke. When there was a pause, I set down my fork and said, in a calm voice, that I wanted to add a few details for everyone's understanding. I explained that Tessa had told me the coastal trip was a girls' retreat with colleagues from the travel agency, with no men involved, and that this was the reason I had watched Maddie alone for 3 days. I said that later I had seen Dylan's public teaser and then the longer video he played on a TV at the party, where the dates on the screen matched exactly the days of that supposed girls' trip. I described the balcony scene, the bracelet, and the captions that called it a secret coastal escape. My tone stayed flat, like someone reading a shipping manifest aloud, but the table grew very quiet. Tessa reacted by laughing again, though the sound came out sharper. She claimed that the footage was old, that Dylan had just finally edited it and used creative dates for effect. When I calmly repeated that the overlay showed the exact month and year of the trip she had just taken, she shifted the story, saying Dylan must have used an automatic setting or made a mistake. When I pointed out that in one clip she mentioned a recent travel trend by name, something that did not exist years ago, she finally snapped and said in indirect speech that even if the trip had been more recent than I thought, it had meant nothing, and that I was the one trying to turn a piece of work content into a crime. Lourdes jumped in, slamming her hand lightly on the table. She said that I was humiliating her daughter in front of everyone, and that I needed to stop treating Tessa like she was on trial. She claimed I had always had trust issues, and that I was obsessed with her past relationship, even though it was none of my business who she had dated before our marriage. I answered that I was not speaking about the past at all. I was speaking about a trip that took place during our marriage, on days when I believed she was with female colleagues. I did not raise my voice, I did not insult anyone, I simply repeated the timeline. My mother, Irene, spoke quietly from her place near the end of the table. She said, in a calm tone, that the problem was not that Tessa had an ex, or a history, but that she had lied about who she was spending 3 days with, and then allowed that trip to be turned into a public piece of entertainment. She added that when people tell different stories to different listeners, written evidence becomes important. Raphael stared down at his plate, his jaw tight, and muttered something about not wanting a scene at his birthday. Caleb shifted in his seat and said that he had originally told me not to explode over a video, but now that he had heard the dates and details, things did not sound as harmless as he had assumed. Maddie watched the adults with wide eyes. Her fork paused over her plate. I saw her tracing patterns in her mashed potatoes while she listened to raised voices circling around words like trust, respect, and past. I felt a cold kind of clarity then. This was not just about me and Tessa and Dylan. It was about what our daughter would learn from watching her mother laugh off secret trips and her father either swallowing it or setting a boundary. I realized I could not protect her from every painful truth, but I could at least show her that someone in her life valued honesty enough to stand up for it without screaming. The fight at the table slowly dissolved under the weight of plates being cleared and the arrival of a birthday cake. People focused on candles and singing, pretending for a few minutes that nothing serious had been said, but the words hung in the air even after we left the restaurant and drove home. The next afternoon, when the tension had settled into a heavy silence, I took Maddie to the park. We walked along the path until we reached a bench near the playground, where children ran from slide to swings. She sat beside me, legs too short to reach the ground, and talked for a while about her friends and a drawing she wanted to make. After a few minutes, she went quiet and stared at her shoes. Then she asked a question in a small voice. She wanted to know why people had shouted at dinner and why the TV at the party had shown Mom on vacation with someone else, and why I had looked so sad behind everyone. She asked if we had forgotten to invite her and me, and if the trip was supposed to be a secret from us. I swallowed before I answered and told her, in gentle, indirect speech, that sometimes adults did things they were not proud of and then tried to tell different stories to different people. I said that what mattered most was that she understood none of this was her fault and that both of her parents loved her, even if we were not agreeing about how to act. She nodded slowly, considering my words, then asked if we were going to stop being a family because of that trip. I told her that we would always be her family, but that grown-ups sometimes had to make hard choices to protect what was left of their own hearts. I did not promise her that nothing would change. I only promised that I would not shout or disappear without explanation. She seemed to accept that for the moment, then slid off the bench and ran toward the swings, calling for me to watch how high she could go. As she pumped her legs and rose into the air, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a new calendar reminder filling the screen. Stonebridge Cowork, 9:40. AM meeting personal. This was one I had set after the restaurant, when I finally admitted to myself that I needed to talk to someone outside the family. I stared at the reminder for a long second while Maddie laughed in the background. Then I pressed dismiss, not because I intended to avoid it, but because I now understood what I would say in that room. For the first time, my questions were no longer muddy feelings. They had dates, images, and a video that had played in front of everyone while my wife stood there pretending it was nothing. The morning of the Stonebridge co-work meeting, I woke before the alarm and lay there listening to the faint sounds of traffic. Tessa was already up, moving around the kitchen, speaking into her phone in the upbeat tone she used when talking to clients or friends about campaigns. I got dressed quietly, helped Maddie with her breakfast, and told Tessa in indirect speech that I needed to work from another location for a while to focus. She barely looked at me, just nodded, and said that whatever I needed to do to fix my mood was fine, because she was tired of walking on eggshells. I kissed Maddie on the top of her head, told her I would be back before bedtime, and left the apartment with my laptop bag over my shoulder and the sticky note inside my wallet pressing gently against the leather. The Stonebridge building was a converted warehouse with glass doors and a bright lobby, the kind of place where people sat on soft chairs with laptops and expensive coffee cups. I checked in at the front desk and was shown to a small meeting room with a glass wall and a table just big enough for two. The person I was scheduled to meet arrived a few minutes later, carrying a tablet and a notebook. They greeted me in a neutral, professional way and asked what had brought me there. I took a breath and told them, in slow, indirect speech, that my wife had taken a trip she called a girls' retreat, that later I had seen video evidence of that same trip framed as a secret escape with her ex, and that when I asked questions about it, I became the villain in the eyes of her family and friends. I explained that we had a daughter, that I did not want to tear her life apart, but that I also did not want to raise her in a marriage where lies were turned into entertainment for other people. I said that I worked with numbers and roots, and that I was used to solving problems with clear information, not with shouting. I told them that I had collected dates, screenshots, and short recordings, not to attack my wife, but because I was already being gaslit by different versions of the story and needed something solid to stand on. The person listened carefully, took a few notes, and then outlined, in calm terms, what options existed if I chose to end the marriage. They described what a petition meant, how temporary arrangements for finances and parenting time might work, and what could be done to limit chaos for Maddie. They did not tell me what I should do, they only drew a map and showed me where the paths led. When I left the co-working space, the air outside felt sharper, as if the outlines of buildings and cars had been traced more clearly. I understood now that there was a formal way to respond to what had happened, one that did not depend on whether people at a party believed my side of the story. On the drive home, I thought about Maddie's question on the park bench and Irene's quiet reminder about written proof. I realized that even if I did nothing with the information yet, I had already crossed a line inside myself. I could no longer pretend that this was just a rough patch or a misunderstanding that would fade on its own. That evening, after Maddie had gone to bed and Tessa was scrolling on her phone in the living room, I went to the small desk nook in our bedroom and opened my laptop. I created a new folder structure, simple and clean. Home, Auto, Bank, Archive A, Archive B. Under Archive A, I made subfolders for trips, videos, messages, and notes. I moved Dylan's coastal reel into trips, then added the still frames I had captured and the short recording from the rooftop party. In messages, I saved screenshots of group chats where people joked openly about the secret trip. In notes, I dropped a copy of the spreadsheet I had kept since the girls' retreat, the columns now filled with dates, claimed stories, and confirmed realities. A small window popped up from the corner of the screen saying that my files had been uploaded successfully to the cloud. The message was small and easy to ignore, but to me it sounded like a latch clicking into place. In the hallway, I switched on the old printer we kept on a narrow table. It whirred awake, shook the dust off its internal rollers, and began to hum. I printed selected screenshots and transcripts I had typed out from the video and from conversations. As the sheet slid out, the smell of warm toner filled the air. I gathered them carefully, tapping the edges against the table to align them. From the shelf above, I took down an almost empty binder we had once used for meal plans and chore charts. I slipped each printed page into a clear sleeve and snapped them into the rings, one after another, until the binder became noticeably thicker. On a small label for the spine, I wrote the word household in plain letters and slid it under the plastic cover. When I put the binder back on the shelf beside our existing utilities and bank binders, it looked ordinary from the outside, just another piece of our domestic life. Only I knew that inside it was the quiet record of how that life had been treated. Next, I opened the drawer under the printer table and took out a small USB stick. I plugged it into the laptop and copied the most important digital files. The rooftop recording, the spreadsheet, the screenshots where dates and locations were clear, the backup of Maddie's birth certificate, and a simple text file where I had written out a timeline of events. When the progress bar reached the end, I ejected the drive and wrote today's date on a tiny sticker I wrapped around it. Then I walked to the hallway cabinet where we kept our paperwork. I pulled out the heavy taxes binder, opened the back cover, and taped the USB stick flat against the cardboard inside. I pressed down on the tape until it held firm, then closed the binder and slid it back into place. After that, I locked the cabinet door with a small key we almost never used. The sound of the lock turning was soft but very clear in my mind. The next few days, Tessa seemed determined to repaint our life in bright colors. She signed up to help with a school event at the community center hall, telling me in indirect speech that she wanted people to see us as a united family, and that I needed to stop dragging the trip into new rooms. She dressed Maddie in a neat outfit, packed snacks, and reminded me that we were expected to show up together and look normal. I went because I refused to let my absence be turned into another piece of evidence that I was the problem. The community center hall was crowded and loud, full of kids running between tables set up for crafts and games. Parents stood in small groups, talking over the noise. Tessa moved through the crowd as if she owned it, laughing with other mothers, adjusting decorations, and checking her phone whenever it buzzed. She told a group of parents, in a half-joking tone, that her husband had been going through a jealous phase because of an old trip she had worked on with her ex, and that she was hoping he would get over it soon so they could go back to being the fun couple. A couple of parents gave me sympathetic looks. One or two looked at me like I was unreasonable. I waited until I heard her complete her version of events, talking about creative projects, old boyfriends, and silly misunderstandings. Then I walked over, calm and steady, and joined the circle. I did not raise my voice or mention dates like a prosecutor. I simply said that what had hurt me was not an old relationship, but a recent trip that had been hidden behind the words girls retreat and then turned into a secret coastal video played on a big screen. I added that I understood people wanted to avoid drama at school events, so I would not argue further here. I said, in a level tone, that I was done trying to fix this in living rooms and party spaces. From now on, I would handle everything properly, in places where stories had to match evidence. Tessa stared at me as if she did not recognize the version of me standing there. She opened her mouth as if to start another speech about jealousy and control, but before she could, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I took it out and saw a small alarm I had set earlier slide across the screen. Paper drop, 3:15 p.m. I silenced it with one touch and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Across the hall, I saw Irene watching us near the refreshment table. She met my eyes and gave a small nod that said she understood, even if she did not know every step I had taken. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I had said exactly enough, no more and no less. The day everything changed for good did not arrive with dramatic weather or flashing lights. It was an ordinary weekday with pale sky and normal traffic. Lourdes had been scheduled for some medical tests at the hospital after complaining of dizziness, and Tessa went there early to sit with her and post a few messages about family and health. She sent me a short text saying that she was at the hospital cafeteria getting coffee and wishing her mother luck. I replied with a simple message telling her I hoped the tests went smoothly. There was nothing in our exchange that hinted at what else would happen in that building. Later that morning, I walked through the hospital's automatic doors, carrying nothing but my phone and my ID. The lobby smelled of disinfectant and weak coffee. People moved around me with that slow, careful pace people adopt in medical spaces. I followed signs to the cafeteria and found a table near the wall, partly shielded by a large plant. From there, I could see the serving line, the tables, and the entrance. I bought a coffee I did not really want and sat down with the tray in front of me, my hands resting lightly on either side. On my phone, there was a brief message from the private contact I had spoken to before, confirming that arrangements had been made for today and reminding me that I did not need to speak if I did not want to. Tessa entered the cafeteria a few minutes later, phone in one hand, hospital visitor badge clipped to her shirt. She stood in the coffee line, talking into her phone about how stressful it was to deal with an anxious parent and how she wished her husband would be less dramatic at home so she could focus. She did not see me at first. She paid for her drink, moved toward an empty table, and sat down with her back partially turned in my direction. As she stirred sugar into her coffee, a man in a neat jacket approached her table with a folder in his hand. He asked in a polite, clear tone if she was Tessa Merrow. She answered without thinking that she was, assuming he was hospital staff or a survey worker. He opened the folder, took out a sealed envelope, and told her that he was there to serve her with a petition for the dissolution of marriage and associated temporary orders. The words sounded very calm coming out of his mouth, as if he were reading from a script he had recited many times. The noise of the cafeteria dipped for me in that moment. All I really heard was that phrase, laid over the memory of Dylan's voice, calling the coastal video a secret trip. Tessa stared at the envelope as if it were a mistake, then reached out and took it. She tore it open without thinking and pulled out the top pages. Her eyes moved down the lines quickly at first, then slowed. I watched her absorb the words about marriage, dissolution, temporary arrangements for finances, and a parenting schedule for Maddie that did not depend on whether her mother was in the mood to tell the truth that day. Her head turned slightly, and she finally saw me sitting at my table, my coffee untouched, my expression steady. The man with the folder turned toward me and walked over. He asked me quietly to confirm my name for his record. I gave my full name, Rowan Merrow, and he checked it against his notes. Then he said, in that same neutral tone, that service was complete. After that, he closed his folder and walked out of the cafeteria, already moving on to whatever task came next. Around us, nurses and visitors continued their meals. A child dropped a spoon and laughed when it clattered. Tessa rose from her chair and crossed the distance between us, the papers trembling slightly in her hand. She asked, in an urgent, indirect voice, how I could do this to her here, in a hospital, while her mother was being tested. She said I was cruel, that I was proving to everyone that I was the controlling villain she had always tried to defend me against. She insisted that it had only been a trip, only a video, only content, that I was throwing away a family over footage that meant nothing. I listened without interrupting, then answered in a low, even tone that what had meant nothing to her had meant everything to me. I told her that when she took a secret trip with her ex and let him play it in front of friends while everyone laughed, and I stood there watching, something broke that did not grow back. I said that when she turned that trip into a joke and let her mother and friends blame me for objecting, she left me with two choices: swallow it and teach our daughter that promises were for show, or take a step she might never forgive, but that I could explain to Maddie when she was older. Yet, I said I had chosen the step I could explain. I reminded her that I had not shouted in any room, that I had not tried to destroy her work or her friendships. I had simply brought what happened into a place where stories were written down and checked. As I spoke, Lourdes appeared at the cafeteria doorway in a hospital gown and cardigan, leaning slightly on the frame. She saw the envelope and the pages in Tessa's hand, then saw me sitting at the table. Her face crumpled into a confused mixture of anger and fear. She asked in a thin, indirect voice what was going on and whether we were really doing this here. Tessa looked between her mother and me, papers shaking, words failing her for once. I finished my sentence, picked up my tray, and stood. I did not wait for another round of blame or denial. I walked past them both, toward the cafeteria exit, hearing only the rustle of paper as Tessa's hand tightened around the petition. The automatic doors at the end of the corridor slid open when I approached, letting in a breath of cooler air from outside. For a second, the glass reflected all three of us. Tessa with her envelope, Lourdes in her gown, and me walking away. Then the reflection broke as I stepped through, and the doors closed behind me with a soft hiss.